Poland in antiquity is characterized by peoples belonging to numerous archaeological cultures living in and migrating through various parts of the territory that now constitutes Poland in an era that dates from about 400 BC to 450–500 AD. These people are identified as Celtic, Germanic, Baltic and Thracian tribes. Other groups, difficult to identify, were most likely also present, as ethnic composition of archaeological cultures is often poorly recognized, while lacking use of a written language to any appreciable degree. Many of them developed relatively advanced material culture and social organization, as evidenced by the archaeological record. For example, judged by the presence of richly furnished, dynastic princely graves. Characteristic of the period was high geographical migration rate of large groups of people, even equivalents of today's nations. This article covers the continuation of the Iron Age, the Latin and Roman influence and migration periods. Latin period is subdivided into Latin A 450 to 400 BC, Latin B 400 to 250 BC, Latin C 250 to 150 BC, Latin D 150 to 00 BC. 400 to 200 BC is also considered the early pre-Roman period, and 200 to 00 BC the younger pre-Roman period. It was followed by the period of Roman influence, of which the early stage had lasted from 0 to 150 AD, and the late stage from 150 to 375 AD. 375 to 500 AD constituted the migration period. The Celtic peoples established a number of settlement centers beginning in the early 4th century BC, mostly in southern Poland, which was at the outer edge of their expansion. Through the highly developed economy and crafts, they exerted lasting cultural influence disproportional to the small numbers in the region, expanding and moving out of the homeland in Scandinavia and northern Germany. The Germanic peoples had lived in today's Poland for several centuries, during which period many of their tribes also migrated out in the southern and eastern directions. With the expansion of the Roman Empire, the Germanic tribes came under the Roman cultural influence. Some written remarks by Roman authors that are relevant to the developments on Polish lands have been preserved. They provide additional insight when compared with the archaeological record. In the end, as the Roman Empire was nearing its collapse and the nomadic peoples invading from the east destroyed, damaged or destabilized the various Germanic cultures and societies, the Germanic people left Eastern and Central Europe for the safer and wealthier southern and western parts of the European continent. The northeast corner of contemporary Poland's territory was and remained populated by Baltic tribes. They were at the outer limits of significant cultural influence of the Roman Empire. Celtic peoples, archaeological cultures and groups. The first Celtic people arrived in Poland, coming from Bohemia and Moravia, around or after 400 BC. Just a few decades after the Latin culture era was born, they formed several enclaves mostly in the southern part of the country, within the Pomeranian or Lusatian populations, or in areas abandoned by those people. The cultures or groups that were Celtic, or had a Celtic element in them, lasted at their furthest extent to 170 AD, after the Celts moved in, and during the tenure, the bulk of the population had begun acquiring the traits of archaeological cultures with a dominant Proto-Germanic or Germanic component. In Europe, the expansion of Rome and the Germanic pressure checked and reversed the Celtic expansion. At first, two groups established themselves on fertile grounds in Silesia, one on the left bank of the Oder River south of Wrocław, in the area that included Mount Leza, and one around the Glubczyce Highlands. Both stayed in the respective regions during the 400–120 BC period. Burial and other significant Celtic sites in Glubchiche County were investigated in Kitras and nearby Aotearoa. The lesser group disintegrated eventually within the local population, while the one at Glubchiche upland apparently migrated out in the southern direction. More recent discoveries include Celtic settlements in Wrocław County, where in Wojkowice a well-preserved 3rd century BC grave of a woman with bronze and iron bracelets, brooches, rings and chains was found. In another 100 years or more, 2 groups arrived and settled the Upper San River Basin and the Kraków area respectively. This last one, together with the local population developing at about the time the pre-war's culture characteristics, formed the mixed Tyniec group in existence 270–30 BC. The rise of the Tyniec group took place in particular about 80–70 BC, when the existing settlements received Celtic reinforcements from the more southern populations being displaced from Slovakia by the Dacians. In the 1st century BC another small group settled probably much further north, in Kujawi, and finally there was the long-lasting mixed Pukov culture associated based on Roman sources with the Celtic Cotini, whose northern reaches included parts of the Beskids mountain range and even the Kraków area. Economy and crafts, trade and contacts, art. The Celts practiced advanced agriculture and favored fertile lands. They brought with them and disseminated the inventions, including a variety of tools, and other achievements of Latin culture. Celtic farmers used plows with iron shears and fertilized fields with animal manure. The livestock consisted of selected breeds, especially sheep and large cattle. The rotational querns that they invented had a stationary lower stone and an upper one rotated by lever. Iron was obtained in greater quantities from a locally available turf ores. Its metallurgy and processing were improved, resulting in the manufacturing of stronger and more resistant tools and weapons. The ceramic shops used the potter's wheel and produced with great precision baked, thin-walled painted vessels, one of the best in Europe. Domed bilevel furnaces were used, the pots being placed on a perforated clay shelf with the hearth underneath. Glass and enamel were produced. Gold and semi-precious stones were processed for jewelry. The Celtic communities kept extensive trade contacts with the Greek cities Etruria and then Rome. They were involved in the amber trade, whose route ran between the Baltic and Adriatic seas, but amber was also worked on in local shops. Metal coins were used and minted around Kraków in the 1st century BC and elsewhere. In Gorzan near Oswiecim a whole treasure of Celtic coins was discovered. Original Celtic art found its expression in numerous decorations, where plant, animal and anthropomorphic motifs were used. The various Celtic achievements were adopted by the native populations, but usually with considerable delay. Prominent settlements and burial sites. The settlement in Aotearoa functioned from the beginning of 4th to the end of the 2nd century BC. 100 people lived in over 20 houses supported by pillars, with walls made of beams, finished with clay and painted. They were positioned on an elevated area, but the Celtic settlements in Poland had no defensive reinforcements. After the Celts evacuated the area, the Aotearoa settlement remained uninhabited for 150 years, before being reoccupied by the pre-war's culture people and later the Slavicis. Objects recently found at Aotearoa include a collection of gold and silver coins minted by the Boii tribe, Greek coins from Sicily and other colonies, and various metal decorative items. Clay containers, jewelry and tools were recovered in the past. Aotearoa was a major Celtic trade and political center, one of the very few in Central Europe. a source of great profits and northernmost of their Amber Road stations. Among the most significant Celtic finds in Lesser Poland are the extensive and wealthy settlement in Podlice and its associated cemetery in Zaszowie, both in Wieliczka County, and a multi-period settlement complex in Aleksandrowice, Kraków County. The Podlice site was occupied from the mid-3rd century BC on and yielded many metal objects, coins and coin blank molds, large collection of glass bracelets. The Zaszowie Celtic graves have the form of large dug-out rectangular enclosures containing the ashes and grave offerings, such as pottery and personal ornaments. Graves of the same type but of a later period, 1st to 2nd century AD, are also found around Kraków, which demonstrates continuation of the Celtic tradition even after the arrival of Germanic tribes in the area. The Celtic burial site investigated in Aleksandrowice contains a rich 2nd century BC assemblage of funerary gifts including iron weapons and decorative elements. The unique fancy decorations, including a sheath with a recurring dragon motif, relate the findings only to the Celtic settlement area in Slovenia and western Croatia. Spiritual life and cult sites. Within the Celtic spiritual sphere there is considerable variation. The 4th and early 3rd century BC burials in Wrocław and Lesser region are skeletal. Sometimes a man and a woman were buried together, suggesting the known Celtic practice of killing the wife during her husband's funeral. But women were usually buried separately with their jewelry. Some of the dead were given meat and a knife for cutting it. For the 3rd century on, the bodies were cremated, which was also the case in all of the Lesser Poland burials. There in Owanowice the graves of Celtic warriors contain a very rich assortment of weapons and decorations. Mount Lesser Formation is believed by many to have been a place of exceptional cult significance over many centuries, possibly going back all the way to the Lusatian times, but especially for the Celts. Chronicler Thietmar of Mersburg mentions in the early 11th century the mountain as a place surrounded by adoration because of its size and the cursed pagan ceremonies carried out there. The summits of this and of the neighboring mountains are circled by stone rings and monumental sculptures. Diagonalized cross signs found on many of the stone objects may have had their origin in the Hallstatt Lusatian solar cult. Such signs can also be seen on the massive monked stone sculpture that was located inside the largest stone ring on Mount Lesser itself and is, therefore, believed to originate from the Hallstatt cultural circles. The stone rings also contain fragments of Lusatian ceramics. The younger sculptures have the distant counterparts in the Iberian Peninsula. Celtic art are thought to be the work of the Celtic people, who developed the Lesser cult centre further. After that, the Mount Lesser area cult was probably revived by the Slavs, who arrived here in early Middle Ages. Early Germanic peoples, Latin and Justorf cultures in the role. The Proto-Germanic or Germanic cultures on Polish lands developed gradually and in a diverse way, beginning with the old local Lusatian and Pomeranian stock, influenced and augmented first by Latin culture and the Celtic people, and then by the Justorf culture and its tribes, which settled northwestern Poland beginning in the 4th century BC, and later migrated in the southeastern direction through and past the main stretch of Polish lands. The disappearing Celtic people made a big impact in Central Europe and left a lasting legacy. Their advanced culture catalyzed economic and other progress within the contemporary as well as future populations, which had often had little of no ethnic Celtic component. The archaeological period is considered Latin until the beginning of the Common Era, the beginnings of the powerful ascent of the Germanic people who replaced the Celts are not easy to discern. The early Germanic just-off cultural sphere was in the beginning an impoverished continuation of the North German Urnfield culture and the Nordic circle cultures. It formed around 700–550 BC in northern Germany and Jutland under the Hallstatt influence, and in just-off's early stages its funeral customs resembled a lot those of the contemporary Pomeranian culture. For the just-off culture, which rapidly expanded from around 500 BC on, two groups sprang and settled the western borderlands of Poland during the 300–100 BC period. The Oder group in western Pomerania and the Guben group further south. These peripheral for the just-off culture groups very likely originated as Pomeranian culture era populations influenced by the just-off cultural model. Just-off communities established large burial grounds, separate for men and women. The dead were cremated and the ashes placed in urns, which were covered by bowls turned upside down. Funeral gifts were modest and rather uniform, indicating a society that was neither affluent nor socially diversified. The above-mentioned migration was undertaken by a part of the just-off population, which probably included the tribes later called Bastarnae and Seri in Greek written sources, noted because of the military exploits around Greece and Greek colonies in the later part of the 3rd century BC. The route went along the Vata and Notek rivers, then crossed Kujawi and Mosovia, turned south along the Bug River and continued on to what today is Moldavia, where they settled and developed the Poinosti Lukasiuka culture. The route is marked by archaeological findings, especially the characteristic bronze crown-shaped necklaces. Oksui culture and Przeworsk culture. While it is not clear whether, and to what degree or for what duration some of the passing just-off culture era people settled at the time on Polish lands, the migration catalyzed, together with the accelerated at this point Latin culture influence, the emergence of the Oksui and Przeworsk cultures. Both new cultures were under a strong just-off circle's influence. The increasingly common within the Przeworsk culture or area presence of objects made by the just-off people reflects penetration by the population. Both the Oksui and Przeworsk cultures fully utilized iron processing technologies, and unlike the predecessor cultures, they show no regional differentiation. The Oksui culture, surnamed after a village where a burial site was found, lasted from 250 BC to 30 AD and originally occupied the Vistula Delta region, then the rest of eastern Pomerania, expanded west up to the just-off Oder group area in the 1st century BC, also including partially what was before that group's territory. It had basically, like other cultures of this period, Latin cultural characteristics, with traits typical of the Baltic cultures. Oksui culture's ceramics and burial customs indicate strong ties with the Przeworsk culture. Men only had their ashes placed in well-made black urns with fine finish and a decorative band around. The graves were supplied with utensils and weapons, including typical for this culture swords with one-sided edge, and were often covered or marked by stones. Women's ashes were buried in hollows and supplied with feminine items. A clay vessel with relief animal images found in Golubiowo Wielki in Gdansk County is among the finest in all of the Germanic cultural zone. The Przeworsk culture, named after a town in Lesser Poland, near which another burial ground was found, originated like the Oksui culture around 250 BC, but lasted a long time. In its course it went through many changes, formed tribal and political structures, fought wars, also with the Romans, until in the 5th century AD its highly developed society of farmers, artisans, warriors and chiefs left for the temptations of the fallen empire lands. The Przeworsk culture initially became established established in Lower Silesia, Greater Poland, Central Poland, and Western Masovia and Lesser Poland, gradually replacing, moving eastbound, the Pomeranian culture and the cloche grave culture, coexisting with the older cultures for a while and assimilating in process some of the characteristics. For example, the cloche grave funerary practice and ceramics. The Przeworsk people must have originated from the above two local cultures, because of the lack of any other archaeologically viable possibility. But in respect to the predecessors, they represent a striking cultural discontinuity. In the 2nd and 1st century BC they followed the lead of the more advanced Celts, who had established population enclaves in southern and middle Poland. The Przeworsk culture developed as a result of the local population's adoption of the Latin culture era models. The passage of the Bastarnareans Iri and the associated unrest likely functioned as the outside catalyzing agent. Just off culture archaeological material has been found in pre-Przeworsk artifact assemblages and in some of the early Przeworsk range. The Przeworsk people mastered and implemented the various achievements of the Celts, most importantly developing large-scale production of iron. Local bogors were used for that purpose. They sometimes formed mixed groups and cooperated within common settlements with the Celts, of which the Tyniec group in the Kraków region and another one in Kujawi are the known examples. Arms, clothes and ornaments were patterned after the Celtic products. In the early stages the Przeworsk people displayed no social distinction. The graves were alike and flat, and ashes together with funeral gifts buried, usually without urns. Religious practices of pagan Germanic people included offering ceremonies performed in swamp areas, involving man-made objects, produce, farm animals, or even human sacrifice, as was the case at a site near Słowicowo in Słupska County. Another such investigated site is in Aotearoa, Grodziec County. Dog burials within or around a homestead were another form of protective offerings, as the Celtic domination in this part of Europe was coming to an end and the borders of the Roman Empire had gotten much closer. The Przeworsk culture era people were being subjected to the Greco-Roman world's influence with a rapidly growing intensity.